Video, we're going to introduce the respiratory system. And I like to introduce two main things. One would be the adaptive functions of possessing a respiratory system. And two would be what are the main topics, what are the main points of focus where we're going to emphasize some detail and some explanation. Okay, and the figure to the right here will help us sort of run through that list of main topics. But first, let's look at some adaptive functions, right? And so we have this respiratory system, right, over here in this upper left panel here. We've got our trachea leading to our bronchi, right? Trachea is here. Air inflow, right, into the system would travel. We have arrows out here. Would travel out into these more distal portions of the lung, and again, you can't see the detail here. This is just a sketch, but there's a branching system that provides access to more than 300 million individual little air sacs called alveoli, right? So in other words, each one of our lungs is actually, several 100 million individual little pockets of space. And the rationale for that is an enormous increase in surface area, right? Well, okay, so what's the point of having this enormous surface area? Well, the point of the enormous surface area is comes back to Fick's law, right? And Fick's law explained the factors which limit diffusion, right? And so one of our key adaptive functions here of the respiratory system is to aid oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange with the atmosphere, right? Again, in multicellular organisms, cells within the body cannot effectively diffuse these gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, and exchange them directly with the environment. So we have to have this sort of multi-component system of exchange, right? We have to have a lung that will sort of exchange these gases for all of the cells of the body. And then we have to link that with a cardiovascular system that can move those gases from the lungs to the tissues or vice versa, right? And so really, a lot of people refer to the cardiopulmonary system. Yes, there's a cardiovascular system when you're talking about heart and blood vessels, but the cardiopulmonary system sort of links the cardiovascular system and the pulmonary system. Because again, think of it, half of our cardiac output, right, is going to the lungs at any given moment. The right side of the heart pumps blood exclusively to the respiratory surfaces for gas exchange. Okay, so a big adaptive function is to increase gas exchange with the environment. And we're not just interested in oxygen, we're interested in carbon dioxide as well. So let's focus on each one of those for just a moment. So oxygen, what is the oxygen important for? Well, the oxygen is for aerobic respiration. And by aerobic, we mean oxygen utilizing. And the adaptive function there, so basically what we're talking about is the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Without oxygen, those two components of our metabolism become non-functional. We'll get into the details of why that's true later. But the point here is that anaerobic respiration or metabolism is metabolism, energy energy, I don't want to say energy forming because you can't form or destroy energy, but converting energy from food nutrients into the energy within ATP bonds can be either aerobic or anaerobic. And when it's anaerobic, it's really inefficient. Make about 5% of the ATP that you do when you're aerobic. So for highly metabolic animals like mammals, like birds, like many animals, honestly, they require greater efficiency for ATP production to sort of maintain that high metabolic rate that allows them to move around, find food, reproduce, all of these things, right? If you're an anaerobic, largely an anaerobic organism, which there are very few that are not microorganisms, they're limited in terms of their efficiency of production of ATP and therefore how high their metabolic rate can be, how much work they can do, right? And so again, oxygen is really important to maintaining this high metabolic rate and active lifestyle that a lot of organisms have evolved to possess. Now, let's talk a little bit about carbon dioxide. We don't want to forget carbon dioxide, right? Because oxygen is being taken up at the lungs, but carbon dioxide is being given off to the environment at the lungs. And you might say, okay, well, that's just a waste product, go get rid of it, right? But why is it so important? Well, CO2, getting rid of CO2 is very important because it's linked to, again, we won't get into the details here, linked to pH regulation. And if you recall, that was one of our homeostatic parameters. And really, a lot of people, and it's not technically accurate to say so, but call carbon dioxide an acid. And it's not an acid itself, but because it combines with water to form an acid, it is an acid, it's a pH decreasing metabolite, right, that we produce. And we can go back to our aerobic respiration up here, right? These aerobic pathways, right, they're utilizing the nutrients in our food, the bond energy and the nutrients in our food to make ATP, right? And we use oxygen, if you recall, it's the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain, to sort of increase the efficiency of that. Okay, but as we break down these nutrients, right, we're saving some of the bond energy in ATP, but what are we doing with the carbon and oxygen and hydrogen in those nutrients? Well, the end products of metabolism, the primary end products of metabolism, aerobic metabolism, are water, there's some hydrogen and oxygen, and carbon dioxide. So the carbon in the foods that you eat, that you metabolize, ends up in the CO2 that we exhale. Now, again, because the CO2 is so tightly linked to pH regulation, respiration is a pH modulating organ system, right? The lungs are a pH regulating organ system. So it's not only for oxygen exchange, but it's also for pH regulation. Those are our two main adaptive functions of respiratory function, helping promote aerobic respiration and also allowing for pH regulation. Okay, so let's get down here to our main topics. Right? What are our main topics that we're going to cover under respiratory function? Well, I've got them numbered up here, if you see, right? I've got one, and we'll see one in several locations, right? Here's one, right? And I've got one with these arrows out here, right? Sort of, what are those arrows showing? Well, what they're showing is the rib cage outside the lungs, right? The lungs are inside here. Being pulled outward. Also down here, see the diaphragm label, right? The diaphragm is a respiratory muscle, and so I've got a 1 here. 1 is ventilation, right? Now the broadest explanation or sort of analogy for ventilation is breathing. But we can also talk about sort of localized ventilation. In other words, how well air moves in and out of a particular region, right? If we were to pick this very specific region down here in the lung, we could talk about ventilation of just that region. So ventilation is broadly means moving air in or out of the lungs as a whole, or in or out of specific regions of the lung. Okay, so ventilation would be one of the first things that we'll talk about outside of some general anatomy. And in the second figure over here to the right, we still have one, right? This is a blow up of what I have here in red, right? Circled in red. That's sort of what's called the terminal lung. You'll actually have a model of this in lab, what's called the terminal lung. And it's just showing air sort of reaching the dead end down here at the bottom of the respiratory tree. And so these little alveoli at the end of this respiratory tree, where we found those air sacs. And so ventilation, that includes, right, moving air in and out of those air sacs is also part of ventilation. And so here's ventilation again, right? Moving air into, in this case, a single air sac, a single alveolus, labeled here, right? That's this air sac, right? I'm outlining in green here, right? And everywhere in the lung, those air sacs are adjacent to what I'm outlining in red here, which is the capillary, right? There's billions of pulmonary capillaries surrounding, and there actually be more than one of them here. There'd be another one here, and another one here. It's just like they're literally just lined up around the outside of these alveoli, right? And the rationale there is we're increasing our surface area for gas exchange, right? So let me highlight our arrows here for gas exchange. We're going to be moving oxygen into the blood. We're going to be moving carbon dioxide out of the blood, right, as we just mentioned in the intro there. And they're going to be moving by diffusion. So in step 2 of sort of pulmonary function here, we're going to be talking about the factors affecting diffusion, which are within Fick's law. So here is, right, here's our number 2. And number 2 is really identifying these blue arrows, which is gas exchange from air to blood or vice versa. Okay, so let's put that over here on our list. Gas exchange. And that's really going to be all about understanding how the lungs anatomy and other elements, ventilation, are adaptive to the parameters within Fick's law, right? In other words, enhancing diffusion. We certainly want to enhance diffusion of oxygen into our bodies, and we want to enhance the diffusion of carbon dioxide out of our bodies. Okay, moving over to number 3 here. Right, here's number 3. Number 3 is gas transport. Right, so in the one previously, in gas exchange, we got oxygen into the lungs, or sorry, oxygen into the ventilation, got it into the lungs. In gas exchange, we got the oxygen from the lungs into the blood. So now we need to carry it, though, right? We need to carry this large amount of oxygen that we're taking up to our tissues. Well, oxygen solubility in plasma is not fantastic. You can't just dissolve an enormous amount of oxygen into the plasma and carry enough to remain aerobic. So we need a boost. We need a helper. And that helper is this guy. Right? It's this multimeric. Remember, multimeric means multiple subunits. It's got quaternary structure. Watch that video on protein structure. Right? We've got 4 subunits. I can actually circle the individual subunits here too. Here's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 4 subunits are glommed together in this hemoglobin protein. So hemoglobin is the oxygen-carrying pigment. And it's called a pigment because it has color. There's a heme component, again, things we'll talk about later. And it is absolutely essential for increasing the oxygen-carrying capacity of our blood. It actually increases the oxygen-carrying capacity by about 50-fold, right? So imagine, could you actually survive using 1/50th of the oxygen that you're using right now? And the answer is definitely not, right? So we have this pigment, this protein that is going to bind oxygen at the lung surface, and then of course it's going to have to release it at the tissues once it's delivered to those locations. And so we'll talk about this sort of reversible binding and unbinding of oxygen. To a much lesser degree, it's important for, circle here, it's also important for carbon dioxide carrying, although that's not nearly as important as the oxygen carrying, right? And remember, the locations of binding and unbinding oxygen and CO2 are flip-flopped, right? Remember, the oxygen binding would occur at the lungs, and it would come off at the tissues, at the systemic tissues, right? The non-lung parts of your body. Whereas the carbon dioxide would do the opposite. It would come onto the hemoglobin at the tissues and then be released at the lungs. And so we have to talk about the dynamics of that sort of binding and unbinding, and how do we, how does it get better? Like what regulates the amount of hemoglobin is produced, all that kind of stuff. Okay, that's gas transport. The last main component of our discussion of the pulmonary system will be number 4 up here, right? So 4. And 4 is respiratory control, right? Do you need the same amount of oxygen to your body at rest as you do during exercise? Well, of course not, right? We all know that you increase your ventilation rate and even the depth of your breathing when you're moving around. And so there has to be a mechanism of detecting and then responding to the blood gas levels so that we can adjust respiratory function. And as you see these arrows here, this arrow pointing to the lungs, right? And to the diaphragm, I should say it is pointing to the lungs, but it's pointing to the thoracic wall here even more so. And as we'll see when we study ventilation, we control the air moving in and out of our lungs by controlling the respiratory muscles in the rib cage, and then of course the diaphragm down here. Right, the diaphragm is our main respiratory muscle at the bottom of the thoracic cavity, sitting there right below the lungs. And last point I'll make is that this respiratory control it can be local. There is a local sort of not in terms of overall breathing, but in terms of controlling where air goes within the lung. In other words, some parts of the lung could be ventilated more than others, right? And so that would be local control. We call that autoregulation as well. And the extrinsic form of control is neural. And this makes a lot of sense. This is important, right? This makes a lot of sense because neural, if you recall, neural control is very fast acting. It's we can initiate a response very quickly, and we can adjust that response very quickly. We can turn it on, we can turn it off, we can turn it up, down, and that all happens really fast with neural control. There is no endocrine control of ventilation. The rationale, the logic behind that is that hormones need to be secreted, diffused into the bloodstream, transported by the blood, diffused out of the blood, right? It takes many seconds, if not minutes, to generate an endocrine response, right? And so our oxygen levels, right? Hold your breath for even 15 or 20 seconds. You will hyperventilate upon, starting to breathe again. So we need a very fast-acting system of control. Endocrine is just too slow to be useful in controlling ventilation. All right, and there's our introduction to respiratory function.